Hey team, we're going to learn how we can create a webcam photo filter app in React using Cloudinary. I'm Colby Fayok, and if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. If you've used apps like Snapchat or Instagram, you might have used the features where you can add filters and effects right to your existing photos or even the live feed straight from your web app. And while some of them give you the option to create them for their particular platform, what if you want to add it into your own app and add your own filters and different effects so that your users of your application can do the same similar things? We can use tools like Cloudinary where we can provide similar effects like you might see in your favorite apps, such as style adjustments, where maybe you want to change some of the different colors to change the look and feel of your photo. We can even take that a step further, and maybe we want to provide overlays that go on people's faces just like we see in those apps. So we can use Cloudinary overlays and face detection to do exactly that, or maybe we want to add a Spider-Man mask, or maybe we want to put a hat on somebody. Either way, we can be as creative as we want adding these overlays and using face detection right within our own app. So to start, if you're not familiar with Cloudinary, it's a media platform that provides a lot of capabilities, including media storage and delivery, but also all these different transformation effects like we're going to see today. Now, ultimately, we want to apply these effects to our onboard camera, so we can use this library called React Webcam, where we can simply add it as a webcam right in our app, and we can start to get the footage and even take screenshots of that webcam footage. Now, to bootstrap our application, we're going to use Next.js, which isn't particularly required for this walkthrough, but Next.js is just a great way to spin up a React application really easily with a lot of features built right in. So in particular, I created this demo starter called Demo Camera Filter Starter that we're going to start from, where all it's going to do is spin up a really basic application that has some existing UI where we're going to add the functionality. That way we don't have to spend a ton of time on the styling or the actual in-app things. We can get productive with the functionality. Now, if you want to follow along, you can find this link right inside the description of this video, and you can follow along right with me. But to get started, we're going to copy this command where you can either follow along with Yarn like me or use npx. I'm going to copy this command and I'm going to paste it right into my terminal, but I'm going to also add a directory or project name at the end so I can specify exactly what I want that to be. So I'm going to add my camera filters, and what that's going to do is it's going to take that project that I have on GitHub, it's going to clone it down locally for you. It's also going to install all the dependencies and even reset Git history so that we have a fresh start. But once it's done, you can cd into that new directory and you can even run yarn dev. And what that's going to do is spin up a local development server, which we can open up right inside of our browser. And we can see that when it loads, we have a pretty basic looking app where we just have a still image of a mountain. We have some actions that we'll use soon here. We also have this filters area, which is where we're going to add some of the different filters that we can apply to our webcam imagery. Now, taking a quick peek at the code, we're really going to stick around inside of the index.js file today, where if I get rid of this sidebar, we can look inside this file, and we're not going to really see much that's actually special here, where I have my image that's currently showing, I have the buttons, and I have the filters that are ready for us to get started and use, but I also have some CSS, that way we don't have to focus on adding the styles here. But what we're going to do is we're going to replace some of these static elements so that we can actually make this into a functioning application using our webcam. Now, first things first, before we do anything else, let's actually get our webcam inside of our app. So let's replace this mountain with a webcam. So if we look on the React Webcam page, we can see that we can do this by installing our React Webcam library. I'm going to keep using Yarn, but you can go ahead and use npm if that's what you've been using. And in my terminal, I'm going to go ahead and paste that command, and it's going to go ahead and install that package for me. And at this point, I can spin back up my development server. But now if we look back in the docs, we can see to get started, all we need to do is first import the library. So I'm going to paste that in right at the top, and I'm going to also replace the quotes just to match the rest of my code style. And we can see that now all I need to do is add this webcam component. So I'm going to go ahead and replace this image of a mountain. And when we refresh the page, you should get a little notification that asks you if you want to be able to use your camera. And given that we're trying to use our webcam here, we want to click yes, we want to allow that. And we can see that it's going to spin up our web camera. You can probably even see the light spin up. And you can see me also talking right in the middle here where it's using my onboard camera here as opposed to the one that I'm recording with. But we can see that it's now actively grabbing that webcam live from my machine. Now, the first thing I want to do is we can notice here that I have a square image in the background. Now, we can really choose what size and ratio that we want this to be, but I want to use a square image so that it's pretty consistent across all the different devices that use this application. So I want to make this a square. Now looking at the documentation to see the available options we have, we can use a width and a height, which we don't have listed inside this table, but we also have this video constraints, which is what we're going to use, where we can actually manage the API inside the browser to set the constraints of the media stream that's coming in for that webcam. Now, if we look under this screenshot section here example, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves where we're going to see how we can do the screenshot in a second, but we can see we have a width and a height on that element itself, but we also have this video constraints object where we have a width and a height, and another option we can add is also a ratio, just to make sure that we're confining it to that exact ratio that we want. Now, just to poke on this a little bit further, we can look at the MDN guide for this, where if we head over to the constraints object, we can read up about what exactly that's going to do. But if we scroll down to an example of what they're using, we see where they have that width and the height and the aspect ratio. Now, if you want to learn more about that specific browser API, definitely head to MDN, and I'll include this link inside of the description. But for now, let's copy this constraints object since we're going to use it. And above my home component, I'm going to create a new constant called video constraints. I'm going to set that equal to that new object, where let's say for my width and a height, let's make this 720 by 720, meaning the aspect ratio is going to simply be 1. But then I'm going to take that object and I'm going to go down to my webcam component and pass that in right as a prop. Now, once my page reloads, you'll notice that I'm back to the camera that you might see in the corner there because I can't figure out how to change it back to my onboard camera. But we can see that it's a nice square now, and it's taking up all the room in my desired area for actually being able to show this camera. But now that we're showing the camera, let's figure out how we can actually capture a photo of that. And we can use the native APIs right inside of the browser by extending the React Webcam library that we're already using. Now, if we look back at the documentation, we have two ways to do this, where you can use render props if you want, where you can pass in this function as a child where you get that as a prop to use inside of a button. But what we're going to do is we're going to use a ref instead, which gives us a little bit more flexibility with how we actually present our UI. So the first thing we're going to do is at the top of the file, we're going to add use ref. We're going to import the use ref from React. Now at the top of my home component, I'm going to set up a constant of webcam ref, and I'm going to set that equal to use ref. So now that I created my ref, I want to apply that to the webcam. So I'll scroll down, find my webcam component, and I'll say the prop of ref is equal to that webcam ref. Now, without getting too far into the weeds about what refs are, the way that we need to use this is once React renders, it's going to store that DOM node inside of the webcam ref.current value and property, where we're going to then use that to access the API to grab the screenshot. But because we're using a click handler on a button to ultimately capture this, it's going to be available for us. So on this capture photo button, I'm going to add an on click, and I'm going to set that equal to handle on capture. Next, I want to actually define that function. So I'm going to scroll back up and say function handle on capture. And I'm going to say that I want to grab the webcam ref.current, and then I want to run getScreenshot on that DOM node, where that current is going to be that webcam DOM node so that we have access to the actual API inside of the browser. But I also want to grab that image value. So I'm going to say constant image is equal to that value. And then let's console log that out for starting, just to see what that looks like. Now, when I open up my browser and I can see my web console here, I'm going to click capture photo, and we can see that we have a large string pasted out, and it's a bunch of random characters that we probably don't recognize. But what this is going to be is the base 64 version of our image. And we can see it's the image that's getting console logged out, but we have our data image webp, which is the format. But we can see this is all the data that's actually going to be our image. So what we want to do is we want to take this and just inject it right into the DOM, which is going to allow us to use it as an image inside of our app. So to do this, the way that we're going to handle this is we're going to store this image value in state, so that once that state updates, our app will update, and subsequently we'll have that image available. So to start, let's go back to the top of our file, and I'm going to add use state to my import. And then at the top of my home component, I'm going to say that I want to add my image source, which is going to be a new state variable. And I'm going to say set image source as the function to update that, and set that equal to use state. So now whenever I get this image, I want to use this set image source and set the value to that image. But now that we'll have this available, let's actually use it. So I'm going to scroll down and find my webcam. And for now, just so that we can see both, I'm going to paste in my image and set the source equal to that image source. And let's see what happens. So now this time, and you'll notice that the camera here is getting a little bit laggy. I think I'm just running out of resources trying to run it in both locations. But if I hit this capture photo button, we're going to see that right now I have this weird looking still of me at the top. We can see the live footage of me at the bottom here, still the webcam, but that's because we took that image, that screenshot that we took, and we replaced it right on the page. But now, instead of showing both, let's only show that image once we capture the still. So I'm going to wrap this and I'm going to say, if I have an image source, I'm going to run and then I'm going to include that image. Now, if I don't have an image source, I'm going to include that webcam. But now we can see that the photo is still in here. And if I hit capture photo, if I look at the camera and smile, we can see that it does take that capture and that still image is still there and we can start getting used to it. Now, we want to also be able to reset this though. What if we want to retake that? My smile is probably not the best there. So what if I want to reset this and take it again? Now, the way that we're managing having access to the photo is by simply storing it in state. So all we need to do is set that image source to undefined and it's going to reset that image. And then with our existing logic of having an image source or not, it's going to default back to the webcam where we can take that photo again. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to create a function that says handle on reset. And inside of that, I'm going to say set image source to undefined. Now I'm going to take that handle on reset function, go down to my reset button and add an on click just like I did before. But now inside of my app, if I click reset, we can see that it gets rid of that image and mine's going to black right now because I have conflicting video with my existing webcam. And that's why I'm kind of going back and forth here. But if I refresh the page, we can see that I get my camera back, I can capture the photo again, and I can reset it. And again, I go back to the black one, but if I wasn't using my camera in the other program, it would be able to show that camera immediately available as soon as I reset it. So now that we have this successfully creating a screenshot, we ultimately want to take this image and we want to upload it to Cloudinary because we want to be able to use Cloudinary effects and transformations on this image. So the first thing we need to do, well, is have it inside of Cloudinary. So to do this, we're going to use the Cloudinary Node SDK, and we have a lot of options for what we can do with it, but particularly we want to be able to upload the image, and we're going to be able to do that by simply running the upload function with our image, where we can then get the results right back and then send them back into the application. Now there's two tricks with this. First of all, we want to be able to use the Node SDK, so we can't use it right inside of our React application because it's not meant to be run client-side. It needs to have Node SDKs or Node APIs rather in order to run. So we can't use it in the client, we need to use it in a Node environment. Now, second of all, when we're using it, because we're uploading, we want to be able to have access to upload directly into our accounts. So we're going to need our API key and our API secret. Now, again, we don't want to be able to use those in our client because those are secret values. So the way that we're going to handle this is we're going to create an API endpoint for using a serverless function inside of Next.js, where we're going to post that image data to the endpoint. The endpoint's going to upload it to Cloudinary and then return the results back into the app. Now to do this, we want to go into our source pages directory and then go into API, where we can see we have a sample hello function that just simply returns this JSON object of name John Doe, but we're going to do something somewhat similar, but let's create a new folder inside of that. Let's call it Cloudinary. And then inside of that, let's create a new file called upload.js, where this is going to be our function and endpoint that we call to in order to upload to Cloudinary. So I'm going to paste that snippet from hello into there just to start that function. But what we ultimately want to do is inside here, we're going to upload to Cloudinary, and then we're going to return it inside of that JSON object with the results. Now back to the Node SDK, we want to get started and install this. So we can install this right from npm using Cloudinary. So inside my terminal, I'm going to run yarn add Cloudinary. And now to import it into our project, we can see we want to use v2 here. So we're going to copy this require statement. And at the top of my file, I'm going to paste that right in. So I want to ultimately run const Cloudinary, and I'm going to set that equal to require Cloudinary and v2 of Cloudinary. So next, before I upload anything, I need to configure my Cloudinary instance. So I'm going to run cloudinary.config, and I'm going to pass in an object, and inside of here, it's going to have my cloud name, my API key, and my API secret. So I'm going to start listing those out as cloud_name and my API_key and my API_secret. But I don't want to store these directly in the file because I don't want these values committed to Git. And generally, I don't want to keep them directly in my code. I want to manage them as environment variables to make sure that they're safe when I actually store this code somewhere. So to do that, I'm going to create environment variables for all these things, process.env.cloudinary_cloud name. I'm going to do the same thing for all the other values. Let's paste these in, but then I'm going to say my API key and my API secret. Now, in order to actually use these environment variables, we want to create an environment variable file. To do that, in the root of our project, we're going to create a new file called .env.local. And inside, we're going to define all those. So to do that, I'm going to grab all of my variable names and I can set them equal to their value, where we're going to see how we can grab those right from our Cloudinary accounts. Now, the great thing is once you're logged into your Cloudinary account, these values are super easy to find. It's right at the top of your dashboard. Under account details, we see our cloud name, API key, and our API key secret, where we can copy all these values and we can start pasting and adding those right into our account to make sure that we're able to paste all these values as our environment variables. Now, when using a cloud name, this doesn't technically need to be an environment variable because it can be used publicly, but because we're using the rest of these values as environment variables, it probably makes sense to use this as an environment variable as well. Additionally, make sure you use your cloud name and not my cloud name, as I have a free limited account, so you're really not gaining anything by using my account, so make sure you can sign up for your free account over on Cloudinary. Now finally, as one last thing for our cloudinary.config, I can also add a property of secure equals true to make sure that everything that we use is going to be secure. But now let's get started uploading our image. Now, ultimately, when we get our image, it's going to come in the request. Now, the way that we want to handle this is we want to say that we want to have our options that we pass into this is going to come from json.parse, where we're going to say our request.body. As when we post it, that value is going to be available as a string under request body. But we want to turn that into an object so that we can grab it inside of this options. Now, we can destructure this here, or we can use it straight in the options. I like to destructure things. So I'm going to say constant destructured image is going to be equal to this JSON parse request body. Now, if we look back over at the documentation, we can see that the way that we're going to upload this is passing the uploader.upload function along with the image data. Now we can see here that this is a path because you can optionally pass in a local path, but we have our image data already available, so we can pass that right in. So I'm going to say constant results is equal to cloudinary.uploader.upload, and I'm going to pass in that image data. And we can see here that currently this isn't running asynchronously. I could technically run then at the end, but I want to do this in a way that makes it easy to use with async await. So I want to make sure I can await this command. So I'm going to turn this into an export default async function. And this is important. You don't want to miss this. Otherwise, it might not work properly as we're working through this. So we want to turn this function handler into an async function, and then we can await our Cloudinary upload. But once that is done and we have our results, I'm going to pass in all those results directly as is, and I'm going to also spread it out. So what I'm going to do in essence is return all this data with all my results at the top level of that data. But now that we have this endpoint, let's actually test it out and let's send something up to Cloudinary from our application. Now we have a couple of ways of how we can handle this. For instance, we could probably just run that request right inside the image source here. But alternatively, what we can do is we can use the use effect hook. And what we can say is anytime that the image value changes, meaning anytime we set this image source, or even when it changes back into not having a value, we can run this function inside where we can run that request to upload it and then ultimately return and store that inside of our app. Now, first of all, to do that, I'm going to take this use effect and I want to import that with the rest of my React statement, but I'm going to run a function inside of here. And because, again, I like to use async await, and to do that, we can't do that top level inside of the default use effect function. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a self-invoking function. And I'm going to say async function run, and I'm going to define this function inside of parentheses. That way I can add another set of parentheses after to actually invoke it, and we're going to be able to run our async functionality right inside here. So I'm going to say constant response is equal to fetch, And I'm going to say I want to point that to /API/Cloudinary/upload, where I'm going to send in a second argument with my data along with a method. And I want to make sure I post this request, but then I'm going to send my body, and that body is going to be JSON.stringify, where again, because we want to ultimately accept it as a string, we have to post it as a string. And inside of this JSON stringified body, I'm going to pass directly in my image source as that image property. Now, because I don't want this to actually run if I don't have an image value, and first of all, it looks like I need to update this dependency to image source. At the top of this use effect, I can say if I don't have an image source, I'm going to simply return. That way I don't try to upload nothing. But if I do have an image value, it's going to go through and it's going to try to upload it. And once it does, let's console log out this response to see if it worked. But before we actually run this, it looks like I missed an await here. So we want to make sure that because we're using async await, that we await this fetch when it passes back the response. And additionally, we want to make sure that we turn this into a JSON value, because when we have a response, it's going to be a response object if we're using the default value that's passed back from that initial fetch. So the way that we can handle that is we can either say response.json and we can await that into a new value, or we can just tack on to the end a then, where I'm going to say my R for response is a function. I'm going to say r.json, where it's going to then chain it along, turn it into JSON, and pass it back into that response where I can ultimately log it out. But now if I go ahead and capture a photo, we can see that it comes back and it returns that response. And if I open that URL up inside of my browser, we can see that I now have that image and it's coming directly from Cloudinary. But now once we have this response data, we ultimately want to store this as well, just like our image source, so that we can use that inside of our app. So I'm going to clone this state instance. I'm going to say CLD data, which stands for Cloudinary data. I'm going to set CLD data. And that way, as soon as that response comes back, I'm going to go ahead and set that CLD data as that response object. Now, once we have that CLD data, I ultimately want to replace it in the DOM. And the way that we can do that is we can replace this image source value so that if we do have it, instead of using the raw image source that we got from the browser, we can use that Cloudinary image source. Now, the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to create a new constant called source, and I'm going to set that equal to CLD data.secure_URL. And I'm also actually going to use an optional chain here, just in case CLD data doesn't exist. I'm going to say, or I'm going to use the image source. That way, if this doesn't exist, it'll default to this image source. But now, instead of using image source inside of the DOM, I'm going to say, if image source, or rather if source exists, I'm going to use source, which would be either that Cloudinary URL or the raw image data. Otherwise, if neither of those exist, I'm going to use the webcam. And after we try this again, we're going to capture the photo and we can see the response object comes back. And now if I right click this and open image in a new tab, we can see that that image showing in there is now from Cloudinary. Now, the way that we're currently delivering this Cloudinary URL is simply by using a URL, but we want to be able to use the Cloudinary SDK so that we can easily apply transformations and effects onto the image. Now, to do that, we want to use the public ID. But before we do that, we want to also use a specific SDK. Now, as we talked about before, we can't use the Node SDK inside of the browser, so instead we want to use a client-side JS SDK. Particularly, we're going to use the Cloudinary URL Gen SDK, where we're going to be able to use this client side and we're going to be able to install this right from NPM, just like the other one. So in my terminal, I'm going to run yarn add that Cloudinary URL Gen package. And we can see in this setup that we're going to set it up very similar to how we actually set up our original Cloudinary SDK. So first, I'm going to copy this import statement and add it to the top of my file. I'm going to also create this instance just like Cloudinary is doing in the docs. I'm going to paste it in right above my home so that I can have this available. Now I'm going to rename this to Cloudinary because it'll be similar to the Cloudinary SDK we're using inside of the upload function, just to make it a little bit easier to kind of understand where we're going to use that from. But now we can see we want to be able to set our cloud name. Now, if we remember, we use an environment variable for that. Particularly, we use process.env.cloudinary cloud name. Now the issue with that is because we don't have this prefix to be able to do so, we can only use this in Node. Now that's a security feature inside of Next.js to make sure that we can't accidentally expose environment variables into the client, which would make them exposed inside of an application. But we have a way to get around that, and that's by prefixing this with next_public_ that variable name. So inside of my .env.local file, I'm going to also prefix that with next_public_ my Cloudinary cloud name. And remember, because we are changing that, we also need to go into our upload function and change the Cloudinary cloud name variable there. But now we have this variable and we can get started using the URL Gen SDK. Now, first things first, let's be able to just simply serve our image through the SDK. And to do that, we're going to use the image method. If we look back at the response object, we're not going to pass the image method the secure URL, we're going to pass it the public ID, as that's what Cloudinary knows to actually generate that URL for us. So let's first create that Cloudinary URL. So I'm going to create a new constant. I'm going to call this cloud image. And let's say I want to set that equal to the same thing that we're doing here, the cld data.secure URL, but I'm going to change that to public ID. And if we do have that value available, I'm going to say I want to use cloudinary.image, where I'm going to pass in that public ID. Now, ultimately, I want to be able to use that, so I'm going to replace that secure URL so that it's going to use that cloud image if it's available. Now, when using the Cloudinary API for this, or the SDK rather, the cloudinary.image, we want to ultimately transform this and use it to create a URL. So at the end of cloud.image, we're going to add to URL as a method, but I'm going to also add that optional chain method there just to make sure that we check if cloud image is available, again, if the public ID is available, before we try to turn that into a URL. But now if we capture the photo, we can see that our response comes back, we can see our image here, and if we open it up in a new tab, we can see it still works. But now we want to actually be able to transform this, and if we go to the image transformations page inside of the Cloudinary documentation, we can see that we're going to have a lot of options for how we can do this. And we can see at the top here a couple things that we can do. Now we can do simple things like cropping, but we can also do things like applying special effects. Now I want to do some effects like this cartoonify kind of we see here. So I'm going to select this image transformation types in the sidebar, and we can see a lot of the different things we can do. Where I'm going to select this effects and enhancements. We're taken to the image effects and enhancements page where I can see a lot of different things I can do. Like these artistic filters where it's going to give us a lot of options for kind of Instagram like things where we can change the colors and the look and feel of it to change the colors so that we can see how it looks in a different kind of way. But to do this, we can see exactly with all the different SDKs on how we can do that, where if we're just applying the URL, we can see that it's e_art and our filter name, but we can also see with all the different SDKs like the JS one, where we can chain this effect, and also we can chain this other function that's going to pass in and create that value for us. Now I'm going to do this a little differently, but I'm going to take my cloud image, which at this point should be the cloudinary.image instance if I have it available. I'm going to say, if I do have a cloud image, I want to do some effects in here. So I'm going to run cloudinary.effect, and then inside I'm going to pass my effect value. Now, how about looking through all these, let's add incognito because that seems like that's going to be the most contrast to our original image. Now, instead of passing in the artistic filter function like we saw inside the documentation, I'm going to simply pass in e_art. I'm going to add a colon and then that filter name. And this is the same kind of syntax you would actually see in the URL, but it requires less importing for being able to use the API. So I'm going to create this cloud image effect, and I'm going to pass in my effect art of incognito. But now we can see that the app already refreshed and it's using that new effect, and we can see the image is now black and white. Similarly, if I wanted to use a different one, such as how about red rock, I can replace incognito, and we can see that we have our other stylistic difference. Now, ultimately, we want to be able to have this in a list of filters so that I can click on one of these filters and it updates it to that particular filter. Now to do this, I need to start off by having all these values inside of an array. So I'm going to create a constant, I'm going to say art_filters, and I'm going to create a new array where I'm going to paste all those values inside. Now to get all these values, you can certainly grab them from here, but we can see we have the full syntax at e_art inside of the other documentation page of the actual reference. And once we're there, we can see that I can copy all those values. I can paste them right in, and then I'm going to clean this up so that it's actually an array of data. Make sure that I don't go too far so I don't get some commas from below, but then I can hit enter. I can turn all these values into an array. Make sure I fix that last one because the multi-select, as well as the first one. But now I have an array of all the different art filters available. Now, if I scroll down to my filters section, I'm gonna ultimately loop through all those filters and create thumbnails for each one. So I'm gonna say artfilters.map, and for each filter, I'm going to ultimately return one of these list items. I'm gonna just simply copy that and paste it right inside of that return statement. I want to also add a key to make sure that React is happy since I'm mapping through this list, but then I can start to do things like change the filter name, where we can have that filter right inside of there to add that name. And now we can see we have all those images of the mountain, but now we have the list of the different names. So now let's also make this so that if we select it, we can store that in a state value to use inside of our image. So to start, we want to store the filter that we select so that we can then use it. So I'm going to duplicate this state line. I'm going to say I want to call this filter, and I want to set filter as my method. So what's going to happen is when I run this, I'm going to store one of these values from the array inside of state so that I can then use it inside of this effect. So now if I go back down to my list of filters, on this button, I'm going to add an on click, and inside of there, I'm going to run a function. I'm going to say set filter, and I'm going to simply pass in the name of that filter so that it sets it into the state. But before we preview this and make sure it's working, we can take this a step further and actually use it, where we already have this logic that we're adding that effect. So let's say if we have a cloud image and we have a filter value, let's use it. So I'm going to change this into a dynamic value, and instead of statically adding that filter, I'm going to add that filter state value. But now this time when I capture my photo and I can go down to my filters and I can select a new filter, we can see that it's going to start changing to each and every one of those filters as soon as the Cloudinary version of that filter loads right inside of the browser. Now, like any good app, these filters aren't really handy if we only see the name. We wouldn't want to see what it actually looks like. So let's make sure that these are a preview of each of these images when we're actually trying to run this. So if you're following along with me in the starter, inside the public.images folder, I have this mountain image. So let's upload this to Cloudinary so that we can use it as our preview. So while this is going to be a little hard to see because of the resolution, I'm inside of my directory of this code. I'm going to simply drag this right into my Cloudinary account. But then I can navigate to this image, and I'm going to grab that public ID at the very top. Now to use it, we're going to use this just like we're doing for our CLD data.public ID. We're going to pass in the mountain's public ID to this cloud function. So inside of my filter list, I'm going to find that image, and I'm going to create a dynamic value from this source where I'm going to pass in cloudinary.image, and I'm going to pass in that public ID that I just copied, and then finally the to URL method at the end of that. And if we look in the app, we can see it's still working, and we can even inspect and see that it is using that Cloudinary URL for the mountain. Now, before we apply the effect, we probably don't need to render a 1200 by 1200 image inside of here. So let's resize it to something that's more reasonable for this space. So first, I'm going to change the resize method on here. I'm going to say W200 and H200. That way we have at 2 times for that value so that it looks like it's good in Retina. And we can see that it still looks the same, but if I hover over this image, we can see that the intrinsic size is 200 by 200, meaning it's going to be a lot smaller of a file size. So now let's actually add the filter that we have for each and every one of these to this mountain image. So I'm going to take this filter value, and if we remember from before, we're going to chain the effect method on there, and I'm going to pass in my dynamic value of e_art with a colon, and then that filter name. And we can see that all those filter images loaded with all the different variations. So now we have a preview of what all those different filters look like before we use it. Such as if we want to see what Zorro looks like here, we can see that once it loads up top, we have that vignette around our image. Or if we want to look back at Hairspray, we can see that we get that. Or however you say Daguerre, we get our black and white image. Now, as one last thing for this demo, how about we add a mask on top of my face? Inside of my Cloudinary account, I uploaded this Darth Vader mask that I cut out from the web, and we can see that I have my public ID. Now, how about just like the art filters, instead we're going to create a constant called overlays. And inside of that, I'm going to list the public IDs that I have available for those overlays. Now we can also duplicate this header and this list item where we can loop through our overlays just like we did our art filters. I can call this section overlays, and we can probably keep most of this stuff as is because really all it's going to be is an array of strings. But we can see that the biggest difference here is we're not going to apply that same effect. So to start, I'm going to get rid of that. But before we actually start to manage this inside of the preview image, let's make sure that this works inside of the actual state logic. Now, I also want to make sure that I'm setting this filter separately from the overlays. So the first thing I'm going to do is change this to set overlay, where at the top, I'm going to clone my filter state to make sure that I'm tracking that differently so that I have my overlay and my filter. But now what's going to happen is anytime I click one of those overlays, it's going to set that overlay value. And similar to what I'm doing with the filter, I can do the exact same thing with my overlay. So I'm going to copy this if statement. And I'm going to say if I have a cloud image and I have an overlay, instead of an effect, I'm going to add a transformation. Now, if you do a simple Google search, you can find a lot of different options for finding examples about how to do this. But if we look at placing layers on images inside of the documentation, we're going to see a lot of options for how we can do this. Now, if we look at this layer transformation syntax, this is exactly what we're going to use in our add transformation function, where we're going to say we want to add a layer with L underscore, where we're going to pass in the public ID of our overlay, which in my case was that Vader, and then we're going to add the FL layer apply to that. So to start, I'm going to copy this line. I'm going to paste it right inside there, but instead of having that value, I'm going to make this a dynamic value so that we can say if we do have that overlay, I'm going to use that overlay value as that layer. Now, if I head back inside the app and I capture my photo again, we can see that we do have this overlays. So I'm going to click this Vader option. We can see that it's overlaid on top of the image, but it's not quite what we want. So what we want to happen is we want to use face detection. So this applies to my face. If we scroll down on that page under layer placement and overlay on special positions, we can see an example of this where it's going to overlay on somebody's face. And we can see a bunch of different examples how we can do this. If I look at the URL to see the exact syntax, we can see that if we look inside under this FL layer apply option, right after we have a comma for G underscore faces, which means gravity underscore faces. So we're setting the gravity value to faces. So in addition to FL layer apply, I'm going to add comma G underscore faces. And if we look back, we can see that it actually shifted around. So it's trying to position itself, but we also need to resize it because we don't want it to be so big at the original size of that image. So the way that we're going to do this is we want to apply the value relative to the actual detected face. So to do that, we're going to add another FL specification here. We'll add FL underscore relative. That way we can define a width or height or both based on that relative value. Now in our instance, we don't want to define both a width and a height because our image isn't a square. So that means it's going to reshape and probably skew the image. So instead, let's only specify a height. That way our Vader mask squashes down and does so with those correct proportions bound to the height of my actual face detected. So I'm going to say H for height, and I'm going to specify 1.0, 1.0 being that relative value to my face. And once it reloads, we can see that now the size looks a lot better and it's positioned right on my face. We could probably make that a little bit bigger still because we want Vader's helmet to be the bigger size of my head, right? So instead of 1.0, let's make this, how about 1.2? And that's looking a lot better. We can even shift this up a little bit. And to do that, I can use the Y, which the Y is going to be the Y axis. So I want to say that I want it to go up. So I'm going to use a negative value so that it goes up. And this value again is going to be relative to the actual face that was detected. So we really only need a very small amount. So I'm going to say 0.05 because remember with our 1.2, the 0.2 was still a good amount. So I want a very small amount to adjust this. But now we can't see the top of my head. We see that the neck position is looking pretty good. And I think I look like Vader. Now, just like we did with our effects, we want to be able to show a little preview of this. So we can copy this add transformation like we did before. So I'm going to scroll all the way down until I get to these overlays. And I'm going to go to that change statement. I'm going to add my add transformation just like before and make sure that I change that to filter instead of overlay since that's the variable that we're using. But the only kind of difference here is we don't want to use the mountain because it doesn't have any faces on it. So let's give a real preview of what we're actually showing. So instead of using that mountain value, I'm going to say if we have CLD data and we're going to use the chain operator for our public_ID. We're going to use that. Otherwise, we can still default to the mountain in case that image isn't available. But we can see because our image is still available, we're able to see that directly in our preview now. But whether we want to add an overlay like our Darth Vader mask, or if we want to just add some artistic styles to our photos, we have a lot of options for what we can do to transform our images using the Cloudinary SDK in order to create this webcam photo booth-like experience. The Cloudinary API provides a lot of capabilities for how we can transform our images, both in a practical way, but also in a fun way that we can add some awesome features into our apps. What's your favorite filter or effects or use case, whether it's Cloudinary or some of your other favorite apps like Snapchat? Let me know in the comments. If you want to learn more about the different things we can do with Cloudinary, such as more effects that we can do inside of our application, such as maybe we add AI recognition to our images when they're uploaded so that we can add cool effects based off of what was uploaded or inside the photo, check out my video AI image recognition for auto tagging with Google Vision AI and Cloudinary. Or if you want to learn how to add social login with things like Twitter, where maybe you can add a tweet once somebody creates their picture, check out my video Next.js authentication with Twitter and Next.js. If you like this video, make sure you hit thumbs up, subscribe, and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. Thanks for watching.